me, Mary-Jannet Leith. Today we're going to be talking about Scottish Baroque music. Now I'm Scottish and I'm from Aberdeen on the northeast coast of Scotland, and there I grew up playing the recorder and playing music of all sorts of kinds, Telemann, Handel, and of course some of that wonderful 20th century music for recorder by composers such as Gordon Jacob. But I also played Scottish 18th century music by James Oswald, John Reid, and several others, and I don't think I really realised at the time what a huge wealth of wonderful repertoire there is to play in this genre. And of course there has been some fantastic research done into this repertoire over the past few decades, particularly in Scottish universities. And so now there are manuscripts which are easy to access, and we can even have editions of some of them. So really there's no excuse for us not to get going and performing this music more often, and also outside Scotland. So what is this music like? Well, it's a bit difficult to describe. There's different elements for sure. So one of the kind of subgenres of the Scottish Baroque is adaptations or arrangements of Scots traditional tunes. So in the early 18th century, composers such as William McGibbon, a fantastic Scottish fiddler in Edinburgh, and also Alexander Munro, a few decades earlier, took these tunes and set bass to them. So they would have originally been simple melodies without a bass. But at the time, of course, Corelli was fashionable. All sorts of more ornate and more complicated harmonic pieces were becoming much more fashionable in terms of concert performances. And Scottish composers and performers were rather worried that these traditional tunes, which after all were the heritage of Scotland, might become a bit lost amongst these newfangled works, which of course they also enjoyed. So some of these composers set about to taking these tunes and to what they called kind of polishing them. So they didn't want to change the tune itself. That was very important. They wanted to maintain its authenticity, its simplicity and its style, but they added a bass so that it could be played with a harpsichord or a cello or other continua, and therefore the idea would be that it could be played in concerts alongside Corelli and other pieces that we would now think of sort of regular Baroque music. And of course, many of these arrangements are absolutely excellent. You can find them easily on IMSLP, for example. So endless kind of beautiful tunes with variations often for you to enjoy. And then slightly later, Italian composers also started taking inspiration from the tunes. Francesco Barzanti, for example, he also set many of the tunes to a figured bass, and we often play his arrangements in our concerts. And then also Francesco Geminiani, a fantastic violinist. He really thought that Scottish music was the highest pinnacle of music overall. And again, he used the tunes as inspiration for his own collection of trio sonatas and variation sonatas, which again are fantastic fun to play. Later on, it might have not been so fashionable to take such liberties with the tunes themselves, as later in the 18th century there was more of a drive for finding the original tune and keeping it as simple and as authentic as possible. But in the 1740s, it was a bit more of a free-for-all, so we have quite a great deal of fun music to explore there. Those of you who have tuned into our live streams can't have helped but hear us play some James Oswald, possibly one of the best known Scottish 18th century composers. And his music is really interesting. So he also, like the other Scottish composers, published a publication with a whole host of Scots tunes called the Caledonian Pocket Companion. And these didn't generally have a bass, but the collection is very significant as it has almost over 500 tunes, and some original which he composed himself. And these were published in over 10 volumes during his lifetime, and then subsequently were still in print in the beginning of the 19th century. So very, very successful publication for him, both in Edinburgh and also in London, where he published them. And he also published music in an original style. So rather than taking tunes, he composed the melodies himself. And his magnum opus was a piece, or rather a collection, called the Heirs for the Seasons. And in fact it's two collections. The first published in 1755, with a second part composed in 1756, and then a second one a few years later in 1761. Each collection has 48 airs in it, 12 for each season of the year: spring, summer, autumn, winter. And the wonderful thing about the collection is that in each season, each air is named after a flower or a plant that blooms in that appropriate season. And they're all just one page long, kind of a little miniature. They're really the most beautiful pieces, but what's interesting about them is that the style in which they're composed is what we would now consider Baroque, of course, with a lot of Italian forms and movements and styles, but also imbued, either deliberately or perhaps not deliberately, with Scottish features, musical features, harmonic features, and also dance movements. So I could talk about this collection forever. Safe to say that it's best to listen to it. So let's hear a movement from James Oswald's The Poppy, which is from his first set and A Summer. Century Edinburgh had a thriving musical scene. The Edinburgh Musical Society employed musicians both from Scotland and around Edinburgh, but also from further afield, particularly London and of course Italy, where it sourced star singers and performers. And of course these singers, particularly those who were doing a sort of circuit, didn't really stay that long. But some, such as Barzanti for example, and Schettke, stayed for the remainders of their careers, or at least a substantial number of years in the capital. And there they did all sorts of things. They taught, perhaps copied music for the Edinburgh Musical Society, and also performed themselves. And so there was a kind of exchange of ideas, a movement of styles and genres happening organically between Edinburgh and London, and of course Italy and the rest of the continent as well. And James Oswald, in his early 30s, decided to make a move himself. So he had had a successful career in Edinburgh as a dancing master, but he had greater ambitions. And so he moved in his early 30s to London, where he then set up his own publishing shop with a royal licence, and also performed regularly on the cello, and eventually became chamber composer to King George III. So he really did develop quite quickly a fantastic wide range of musical networks and colleagues. And I find this really interesting because it really just shows how Scottish musicians were able to maintain their Scottish identity in a place which was not their home, but equally were able to sort of succeed and to almost to promote Scottish music in an unfamiliar context. So I suppose that's really a very whistle-stop tour of some of the most wonderful composers in Scottish Baroque music, and I'm sure I'll talk about them again at some point. Next week, we're celebrating International Women's Day, and we'll be thinking about some of the challenges and opportunities for women in early music today, but also talking about how we can access music written by women composers in the 18th century. And Tom and I will actually be performing a wonderful movement from a sonata by the composer Anna Bonn of Venice. See you then.